Good afternoon. Welcome, bienvenue. My name is Carolyn Lavander, and as Rice University's Vice President for Global Strategy and the Carlson Endowed Chair in the Humanities, I'm honored and delighted to introduce today's second speaker in the Rice Global Baker Institute Speaker Series. The Rice Global Baker Institute Speaker Series focuses on France because it is at the heart of our international strategy at the university. Rice's newly announced 10-year strategic plan makes clear the importance of international impact to the university's future. The 5-word tagline for the campaign, in fact, is personalized scale for global impact. And it is a plan in which 3 of the biggest global challenges confronting the world today, namely climate and energy, global health innovation, and urban futures, become the centerpiece of the university's research contribution over the next decades. These, of course, have been core to our research mission from the start, but placed as Rice University is in the energy capital of the world, across the street from the largest medical center in the world, and in the center of a city that is the living laboratory for urban futures, Rice is making a step change in investment in these 3 areas. With a hiring plan of 200 faculty over the next 5 years already in place and underway, the creation of important new research institutes and centers across the university, and the development of our Paris Center, and a new creation of a center in Bangalore, our stated goal is to become the premier teaching and research university, and this vision is beginning to be realized. As an important first step in meeting that goal, Rice launched our first international center in Paris's beautiful Marais district just 2 years ago. This campus has been an important convening space for conferences, research seminars, and intellectual partnerships that have brought the world's best academics and innovators together to problem solve around climate, global health innovation, and urban futures, not to mention fundamental science, arts, and humanities. To raise the impact of these efforts, Rice has formally joined in partnership with PSL, Paris Science and Letters, and is moving forward with a similar institutional agreement with Paris-Saclay. So watch this space in the months and years ahead. And please, when you're next in Paris, visit our lovely Sainte-Croix facility, easily done by just contacting me or the Rice Global website. Today's conversation between French Ambassador Bili and Baker Institute Director Satterfield furthers these ambitious goals. The ambassador has been France's ambassador not only to the U.S., but Thailand, Turkey, China, and Brazil, as well as serving as Director General for Global Affairs, Culture, Education, and International Development at the French Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs. He is truly one of France's most illustrious global leaders. Please join me in welcoming him to Rice University and the Baker Institute. Thank you.
Bienvenue à l'Institut Baker.
Merci beaucoup.
Herzlich willkommen. We're delighted to have you here today, and we chatted before you came out on your background, extraordinary service in a number of areas, China most recently, of critical interest for Europe, for France, for the United States, and I want to get your impressions of the direction of Chinese policy. But first, I'll ask you. We have a robust representation of French corporate life here in Houston, particularly from the energy sector. What brings you to Houston after a very long time, as I understand?
Yes, maybe too long, but it's also, again, I would put the blame on Valérie, our general counsel, because she managed to bring me in Texas after 3 days in office. So then after, she had to wait a new turn after the 10 consulate that we have in the US. So it took more time than I was expecting. I think we have one option that was deleted by some official visit, as it happens. But mainly, so First, it's about the importance of Texas. We have quite a long common history as one of the countries that recognize the Republic of Texas. It's not that known. You know that we participate to the War of Independence, but recognition of Texas, that's another interesting bilateral story. And also these days when I see some CEOs passing through Washington, they all tell me that they are spending billions in Texas. So at the end I had to know what they are doing. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm here. And obviously these actors are usually linked with energy in general, but also say all what is upstream and downstream, and including energy transition. And it's also spectacular to see that Texas is becoming such a diverse hub of energy. So I'm in a fact-finding mood and very happy to have a chance to chat with you today.
Very good. Ambassador, share with us a bit about the status of the energy sector, energy outlooks for France uniquely, and France in Europe, where France played a critical role after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in terms of providing assistance, particularly to Germany, in terms of energy. You've maintained a more significant, a more robust nuclear program than virtually anyone else in Europe. Germany has just now decommissioned the last of its nuclear power facilities. So you have a wider mix of energy sources, but still energy futures, and the transition are a critical issue for decision for your government as well as for ours.
Well, we, like many countries, we had a lot of debate about energy, and in the last decade we have made a kind of pause on nuclear, but nuclear being still a very important part of our mix. But let's say that the last 3 years have really changed the thinking, and we are reinvesting massively in the nuclear field. We have already 4 EPR, or third generation reactors in constructions. One is going to be commissioned in probably February or March, and probably 6 or 8 more in the pipe, depending on situation. So we are in a unique situation because we are having a mix which is quite independent of fossil fuels, yes, and also from gas, of course Russian gas, and less dependent on JNL than especially Germany. So at the moment we are net exporter of electricity in Europe, which may put us in a good position. Last winter, was not that comfortable because we had part of our nuclear park was having a main, let's say, regular maintenance time, and at the same time that we had a few issues that we had to solve on some others. So we had a difficult moment last winter at a bad moment. But now we are back on track, and the new EPR is going to give us more leverage to export. The issue that we had domestically about the role of nuclear energy was also a debate within the EU, and we managed within the EU to have a large coalition of countries supporting nuclear energy. And so to change the rule, because we were in a kind of strange situation where we were somehow in the obligation to sell to our partner for very cheap price or energy, and so we have to make a kind of general reshuffle of EU energy policy to have a recognition of nuclear as a renewable green energy, and to change the price mechanism within Europe to get a fair share of fair price for our exports. We have been also involved in the global stage. We are part of a coalition of countries which are advocating for tripling the production of nuclear energy in the world. And I was part in an event during the UNGAS, United Nations General Assembly, also to do some advocacy for World Bank and other international institutions to start to finance also nuclear, because we have the deep conviction that without the contribution of nuclear energy, there is no way we can be successful in some kind of energy transition, and also to support the need for developing countries.
Where do you see the EU as a whole going in terms of nuclear energy, given the changes that you just described?
Well, there is clearly a dynamic in favor of nuclear energy in Europe, and so that coalition of countries in favor managed to really move EU regulation and the balance of power in the subject. The debate is still sensitive with our German friends. At the moment, they don't have any change, but there is maybe the beginning of a debate in the context, of course, of the war in Ukraine.
Exactly. And talking about energy and going to the war in Ukraine, France will welcome, President Macron will welcome Zelensky tomorrow in Paris for a discussion of French support. What's the French public mood with respect to Ukraine, continued support for the objectives all of us in NATO, the coalition, have been advocating?
I think the general mood is still of solidarity with Ukraine, which is kind of, for the one who is familiar with Asterix and the Roman Empire, we tend to be on the side of the one who is invaded by the big one. And in that case, there is no doubt about who is the villain and who is the good one. So there is that natural support. At the same time, there is also some voices, like in many countries, arguing about the price of energy, inflation, the cost of the war. But I think still a large majority of French people support Ukraine in its struggle for its independence and democracy.
And if you were to extend this topic to your sense in Europe as a whole, we've watched over more than a year now the rise, if not to actual power in government, the increase in influence and presence in assemblies, in parliaments, if not in governments, of nativist, if not isolationist, nationalist movements throughout Europe, including a phenomenon in France itself. How do you reflect upon this?
Well, it's a time of challenge for the world. In fact, I've been a diplomat for, I'm that old, 34 years, I think, if I count my internship in Brazil. And we are in that kind of moment where the tectonic places are moving, and in each of our country there is doubts about the future, about the role of our country, the fact also that our society are changing. We are becoming elder, more senior. There is newcomers, so there is doubts, there is inflation, so there is a lot of issues that are somehow creating a kind of anxiety, and sometimes so it's expressed in some choices. It's a pattern that we have seen in different countries. It's should I say? It's one of the moments where you see the tension with the idea that if you try to put yourself inward, you will be more protected than when you are open, and you have the tension between a reality that the world is much more globalized than it has never been, and sometimes you feel the need to be in the nest to feel comfortable, and that's that tension that we are living in many countries.
I must say, for those of us who have been fortunate enough to travel before the European Union in its current form took place, when border controls were still very present, currencies were multiple, were national before the euro, and you see Europe today as not seamless, of course not. There are national differences, but united and without barriers in the sense that existed throughout its millennium plus of history before. And the nationalist message of going back, of attempting to re-divide, reignite separations, appears simply in dollar and cents or euro and centime terms to be absurd, yet it has an attraction. It has an attraction here in the United States.
It has an attraction, but it has also limits of the attraction. And if you observe the case of France, and I think it's also valid for Italy, most of the parties that are expressing that anger or that doubts about the future, they have been moving toward a more pro-European language. There is no more real important player in French politics that want to go out of Euro, because they realized that it was a non-starter for voters. So sometimes we say, well, we want Europe, but we don't want that Europe. Because then, of course, it's becoming easier to say, well, I will make a difference. One of the questions is really about border and immigration. But even then, it's not really about internal barrier between European countries, but more by the idea that there is a pressure from outside, and
Yes.
that the border system should be more efficient from the outside border of the EU. And from time to time, when you have a decision of one country, because we see some influx from one country to the other, that restore temporary control to make sure that they regain, or to make pressure to the neighbor to do his job more properly. But I don't think that there is anyone dreaming today to be back of the country, or not the country, that the Europe that I knew when I was a young student, that have to show his passport at each border. We don't have even the barracks from Belgium. If you go to Belgium today, we will have to recreate everything. You just continue to, and we will have to stop the train or put the, no, I don't want even to imagine that world. It's
But as you look, and we'll turn now to the United States, you're France's ambassador here, but in many ways your job as an ambassador is to explain what you see here back to your government, to offer your impressions. How do you see the transatlantic alliance, by which I mean both the unique ties between France and the United States, and there are such unique ties, historic ties, but also to the European Union? What's your assessment of where that's going?
Well, I think at that particular moment when tectonic places are moving, it's really important to keep a kind of compass. And I think the transatlantic alliance is one of them. It's a moment where people which are, or countries which are like-minded, that have common interests, common values, that are also applying the same level playing field, should work more together. We have a lot at stake in Ukraine, for not only for Europe, but for the rule-based international order. I don't see Ukraine as a regional crisis. I see really a challenge for the world. And so I don't think that the answer is to create a barrier between us. In the opposite, I think it's exactly the moment where we need when we need to secure our supply chain. It's time for friendshoring between the two shores of the Atlantics. That's, in a way, it can be a positive moment because we have to think about what we have achieved in the last 70, 80 years and what we want for the next century.
Yes. But there are many, as you say, you were ambassador in Turkey.
Yes.
During the period of the great movement, the 1.5 million plus migrants into Europe, and the effects that that's had upon politics redounding down 8 years, 9 years later in Europe. And it's very, very difficult to point out in a very objective, rational fashion as an ambassador or as a government official the benefits that come from openness as opposed to the impact, and the impact has been significant at local levels and elsewhere, of what open or more open borders produce. It's a genuine debate, and it's something that cannot be ignored. It has to be addressed.
Yes, it's completely fair, and that's where the question of level playing field is very important, because it's also clear that if some players are not having the same rules, it's just absurd not to accept the idea that you have to recreate certain kind of protections or to have anti-coercion mechanisms.
Yes.
And I think these last years, Europe has been developing quite a lot of instruments in that regard, because we also acknowledge that just, let's say, free border or free trade for free trade doesn't just work. You have to make sure that we are playing by the same rules.
Exactly. And speaking of playing by same rules, or a spectacular example on the global scale of not playing on that level field, China. You were ambassador in China for a number of years, and they were the years that saw the beginning or the acceleration of the centralization of authority, even out of the hands of the party hierarchy into the hands of Xi. Where do you see China going? And how do we all deal with that?
Well, it has been tough years. I was in China at the moment of the COVID outbreak and during all the zero COVID policy. So it has been challenging. I didn't foresee that my job in early spring 2020 will be to become a specialist in the procurement of medical devices and to ship them to France and to organize a flight bridge to France to send billions of masks. And we were lucky, by the way, that the timing of the pandemic in China and in the rest of the world was not the same, because we could use the production that was foreseen for Chinese need for our needs. At the same time, it was a moment where you could see that the country was having a very, very centralized and tough answer. That was the moment where the law on security was passed in Hong Kong. There were some friction at the Indian border in the South China Sea, and there were a very tough control on the public space. Just to give an example, people of the academic sphere were allowed to come to an embassy twice a year, so they had to choose which embassy and which event they wanted to participate. So that I saw personally the restriction of contact of our embassy to and of course of other embassies. I think it's what I've been trying to advocate in during these years was also that a country with the success of China, with the size of the economy of China, had more responsibility, and that some of the practices that were accepted when China was really a developing country, taking the path with let's say Western countries was acceptable, was not possible anymore when with a country of the size of China. When I started to go to work 20 years ago with China, China was more or less having the same GDP as France. 20 years. In 20 years, it's a completely different picture, and the result of putting some non-tariff barrier to some export, to refuse to certify things, to play with quota, to play to some recipe of product just to have to manage the domestic market while invading of national market was not an option anymore.
And what do you recommend in terms of national strategies? Because this really is something each country must decide for itself. This administration in the US has articulated over the last 6 months, 7 months, a multifaceted approach, which I describe as 4 C's: confront, contain, where Chinese politics or policies are actively hostile and harmful, to compete and compete vigorously when the playing field can be leveled, and to cooperate on those areas, and there always are such areas where there is a consonance of views. But it's a nuanced approach. It's not all confrontation, and it's not all acceptance of the Chinese position. What is France's view on
I think
this?
in the last month, all strategies are becoming closer. When I say all strategy, it's more like a EU strategy and US strategy. The motto in Europe was about China is a partner, China is a competitor, and China is a systemic rival.
Okay.
So it's more or less the same. So it's about managing the competition. We are certainly a partner with China for global challenges. At the moment where former US administration was going in a very different direction, we were very pleased to cooperate with China on climate change. We know that on some development issue like burden of the debt, we need also to cooperate on with China, or which we should try to bring China on board on some debt relief operation that we want to do. The competition part is clearly the one, especially on trade, and the one that was really frustrating is about the systemic rivalry. That was quite clear when China decided, in a way, let's say implicitly, but in a way also obviously, to support Russia in the aggression against Ukraine, which is clearly against the direct interest of Europeans. And during these days, or month, has been using a very tough anti-Western propaganda. I was lecturing with a few colleagues in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Wei Jiaopu to have a lesson on that I will never forget as a way of very aggressive wolf warriors type diplomacy. At the same time, I also find colleagues of the Wei Jiaopu trying to bridge gap, to try to find solution. But that part of really tough anti-Western stand was difficult to bear, because it's really difficult to hear that we are responsible for the suffering of Ukraine because we are prolonging the suffering of the people by giving them the means to defend themselves.
Yes. And the volume and the fierceness of it has increased dramatically these last months. It's not a steady state. It's a rising phenomenon. Let me turn to an area where France has long had a very significant role, the Middle East. Number of profound developments. First, the older one. France has attempted over the course of the last year plus, former Foreign Minister Le Drian has been many times, President Macron has visited several times to Lebanon in an attempt to see if there is some way to stabilize, advance that country's political situation. I remind that Lebanon is now almost exactly 2 years without a president, which sadly is not an unusual phenomenon in Lebanon's modern history. But at this moment, it's a particular deficit, and there are many contributory causes to this, but Hezbollah's political role and political vetoes has been a significant and major contributory factor. President Macron has spoken out this week, calling for arms which could be used to prosecute the campaign in Gaza from the global market to be suspended, not to be done. That's evoked quite a lot of criticism from within France, from outside, but it's obviously an issue. Gaza, its future, where this horrific, miserable situation is going, takes us, that the U.S. is quite concerned with, as of course is the situation now in Lebanon. But appreciate your thoughts on how France sees the situation.
Well, it's one of the saddest issue that we may have, and it's a very emotional one. There is no doubt that France is in full solidarity with Israel and condemned the terrorist attack of the 7th of October, and the same token has been participating of all the operation of defense against Iran. But we are also observing deterioration of humanitarian situation especially in Gaza, and the fact that we are all, and that's part of our values, bound by international law and war of law procedures. And so we have been, and we have also to think that at certain moment, even if you may have tactic victory, you need to have a strategic vision and outcome, and we don't see any alternative to a kind of diplomatic political process at the end of where we are, and there is no alternative to a political process or diplomatic process, that a kind of two-state solution. So we were a moment of, at the beginning of Yunga, 2 weeks ago already, when we were working with US administration and Israel on a ceasefire.
The 21-day ceasefire proposal.
Well, an immediate ceasefire for 21 days to give a chance to negotiation.
Yes.
So the idea that was first we kind of pause and to give time to negotiation. It exploded, as we have seen in different way. That wasn't probably I didn't anticipate the sound it could have, and we try to have kind of consistency between the fact that we want to ensure the security of Israel, but at the same time that weapons that are creating so much damage to civilian populations are putting us also in an awkward position, and I think that was the gist of it. I think the most important thing is that at the end of the day, all military people will tell you the same thing, that the war always ends with politics, and we need at a certain moment a political situation. The question of timing is tricky, and especially when it's very emotional, and there is no doubt that what we have seen is the most awful terrorist attack in history of Israel and since World War II. But at the same time, we need to try to find a way.
Yes, and I would note that France is one of the closest cooperants with us, with the United States, on the Red Sea, on efforts to combat the Iranian missile flow. It's been an extraordinary collaboration, and no question marks about that whatsoever. But the future of the Middle East means a great deal for France, and not just in a transactional sense, but there's an emotional attachment there, as there is for the Kurds and for other communities in the region. And that brings me to my last question to you. We were both ambassadors with not too much time between us in Turkey. So I focused a great deal in my tenure on trying to ease Aegean tensions, to see relations with Greece, particularly Greece, strengthened. That has happened for a variety of reasons. But we also worked very much on EU-Turkey ties, which the United States saw and still sees as in our interest to have as robust an economic commercial relationship. Tell me how France sees Turkey in Europe, Turkey aligned to Europe as a commercial partner, as perhaps a broader partner.
Well, France has been an advocate for EU membership of Turkey, but also a skeptic, depending of some movement, and it has also been linked with the own evolution of Turkey. So there is no doubt that we were at the origin of the custom union, which and also of the recognition of the candidacy of Turkey to the European Union, which, by the way, bring more FDI in Turkey than in all the history of modern Turkey before. So most of the successes of Turkey in the last 20 years is really linked to that recognition. At the same time, we had issues. My first difficult time when I was in Turkey was a proposal of law relative to the Armenian genocide, and we had for a few months a boycott of the embassy and no contact. So we had these ups and downs.
This was when the National Assembly recognized.
No, it was another one. We have, because the recognition is already 20 years ago, I think. This one was, that's very French, by the way, because we have a different interpretation of the free speech. We accept free speech with limitations. So if you say that the Shoah didn't exist, you can be prosecuted in France as it's a criminal offense. And by similarity, we had the same kind of law for the Armenian genocide, and there were no implementation mechanism. We recognize the genocide, but there were no penalty attached. It was not a criminal offense, and some wanted to have exactly the same similarity. It didn't fly because they were not exactly also the same kind of international recognition. It's a very huge debate, but still it has been one of the subjects that has created ups and downs in our relation. And I tried to work a lot on that subject when I was in Turkey, because I think that it could have been also a good way to look back at history in a more positive way, like we have been trying to do with Algeria. But that's still a long journey.
It is indeed, and I encountered the same thing. We were exchanging notes, talking to some of the most liberal, Western-oriented political figures, academics, many of them, in Turkey, when you touched upon the Armenian genocide and the historical record. It was an electric shock, and it's a very tough one. And the U.S., of course, at the beginning of this administration, recognized the Armenian genocide, which I thought was a long overdue historic and moral requirement, with very little Turkish reaction. But it is not a subject on which the kind of discussion you attempted, that I attempted, is possible. And one can see in the Caucasus today the sharp Azeri reaction. France has come into the crosshairs very specifically. To any cooperation with Armenia is still seen as directed against Azerbaijan. We are very hopeful of a peace treaty that is very close. If in fact Baku is prepared to do it, it would be a huge step forward. But these are highly emotional, highly sensitive issues today.
Definitively.
But I think we are very much aligned, the US and France, on our approach on both of these issues. I'm going to turn now to some questions from the audience. And the first one is a bit difficult for an ambassador to respond to. I used to get questions very much like this myself. In fact, I think the identical question was posed to me when I was ambassador last. How are you preparing for a US administration which pivots to an isolationist or protectionist foreign trade policy? Yeah, I'm not changing the words. I got this all the time.
Well, first of all, I think we all acknowledge that we don't have to choose the government of our allies. And sometimes I joke that I still remember that one US ambassador in France tried to make a kind of signal
yes.
40 years ago, and it probably pushed the last person that was needed to go to the other direction. So
yes.
I think we have to be very cautious in being part of any domestic issue. After that, the role of an embassy is always basically the same. We'll say maximize the convergence, minimize the divergence, and try to make your point, and then assume the divergences, but trying not to jeopardize the long-term interests of both partners, and especially when it comes to the US. And I was a bit thinking the same thing when I was in Turkey. We have had diplomatic relation for more than 5 centuries with Turkey. So that even if there was a moment of down, I tried to maintain the link because the long-term relation was more important about the hiccup.
France has one of the grand residences on the Bosphorus.
Oh, yes.
A spectacular, phenomenal location from which your government is progressively extracting the best art and taking it back to France.
I'm not sure about that part, but
Yes, yeah. Yeah, one of your successors gave me a tour of the blank spots on the wall where art had been discovered to be located.
The Ottoman fontaine was restored during my term.
Very good. And the Napoleonic chandeliers from Moscow. Yes.
I found the other one in Belgium, by the way, because we.
Did you?
Yeah.
These were booty from the Napoleonic campaign taken to the embassy, at least one of them. So, but what kind of economic strain does immigration, looking at a more current situation, not the historic or going back to 2015-16, does current immigration into France pose for the web of social security programs in place? So it's really talking about the strain on finance.
Well, one of the discussions that we are having at the moment is the call of is the cost of the medical care, because we have a very generous system that you can be treated for free when you are, even if you are illegal, and it's so it's representing something 1.5 billion. So there is a kind of issue, but the larger issue is that even if it's about, well, all the social, that school, let's say that school is free, health is basically free, and so the question is, can you support the system? Is the illegal migrants that are coming are not in a position to contribute to the economy? So that's about sustainability, that's about fear, but there is always also a question mark about values and the way of the school system is working, and so it's not always rational. It's also a lot of irrational fears that have to be taken into account.
As France looks at the future of energy, you've talked quite a bit about the status, which isn't static, it's increasing, of nuclear energy in France. And there are really two questions here. One is, from a domestic political standpoint, in France, is this increase in reliance on nuclear energy, nuclear technology, something which is broadly accepted by mainstream of French political parties, as opposed to the Greens elsewhere? Mm-hmm. And the second question is, as France looks at other sources of energy, both for Europe and for France, where are you particularly focused? What do you see as the most viable, market viable areas?
On the nuclear issue, I think the general public opinion and parties are in favor. We have also some part of the Green and the Left Party which are opposing, but the Communist Party and part of the left are also in favor. So globally you have quite a large majority in favor of nuclear in France. And the public opinion has a certain degree of acceptance, and to facilitate the new generation of APR, usually we are trying to use the same kind of site for the creation of new plants, because that's also people that are used to the experience and don't have too much fear.
Rather than new greenfield sites.
Yes, that's part of the answer. It's also because these sites were also chosen for good reason, for presence of water, cooling system. On other renewable, we face a certain degree of resistance now for new wind and sun park on soil, especially on the countryside. So we have a program which is developing also a lot on offshore wind, which is having more acceptance. And that's probably where we have more. And then there is a question of hydrogen, but hydrogen, it's still also a question of affordability and probably maybe a connection also with nuclear, because you need also clean energy to make clean hydrogen. So that's work in progress, I would say.
And an extension, which I think is a very good question. France's relationship with Algeria, North Africa, from an energy standpoint, there have been some rough spots in the relationship. Where does France assess stability in the market lies? Is there such stability? Do you still look to Algeria in significant measure for hydrocarbons?
I don't have the numbers in mind, but I don't think that Algeria is anymore that important in terms of gas in comparison with other partner. It still be part of the mix, but I don't think it's kind of dependence or significant enough that let's say that political turmoil makes really a difference. The question of relation with Algeria is much deeper, because we are somehow intertwined country by history, for the better and the worst. And there is worst. I don't completely assume. And when I was mentioning some nice discussion that I had in Turkey about Armenian genocide, I was also mentioning that France came a long way to recognize the use of torture during the War of Independence, and even some huge civilian losses during the War of Conquest.
With any resonance? Did you?
Well, I think it's I try at least with students to make think. I'm not going to tell you that's the truth or that's the truth. I just wanted to make the point that history is sometimes moving during the time, and that something that was a reality when I was a child in the early 70s or late 60s, that was something that we didn't want to discuss, became obvious a few years after. And that even my father, always using that, being a soldier in Algeria, he probably didn't see things because he was more in the engineer corps. And it's only discussing, because that was a debate in these years, that he realized things that happens that he had no knowledge, even being in spot in these years.
It's an interesting point that you bring up those discussions in Turkey, because it may be striking for the audience. This is what ambassadors do. And I was challenged when I was ambassador in Turkey about the turmoil in the United States over readdressing the Civil War and its outcomes, the going back to renaming of military bases to take away Confederate generals' names, and re-examination of U.S. past. And I was asked, and then of course January 6th and the storming of the Capitol building at the time of the vote count, electoral college count. And I was asked, does this make your job as ambassador harder? And I said, no. What it does is allows you to speak from direct real-world experience. These are challenges, and it's how the challenges are addressed. Re-examination of national assumptions and myths. If it yields a better outcome, no matter how fraught the debate and discussion is. I know it has been deeply fraught in France over Algeria. It's deeply fraught, was and is here, over events of 160 years ago in the United States and their sequelae. But it strengthens your ability to speak frankly, to be able to say, yes, it's not the event, it's how you grow from it, understand the lessons. I'm not sure I had much success on the Armenian genocide, but
There is limit to our
There's a
ability
limit.
to convince, but
there's a limit.
at least to connect by not teaching lessons about what happens, but just coming back to plain reality. That's history is complex, and it has not only shining pages. There is always some dark spot somewhere.
Very good. Laurent Ambassador, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thanks.
My pleasure. Valerie, thank you.